Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. I am Terry Kay of the Jewish Grandparents Network. Thank you for joining us today for Facing Crisis in Israel, talking with our grandchildren about difficult times. We know how incredibly difficult and personal this is for you. And we can tell by the number of people who signed up for this gathering today, which is 627 registrants, that so many of us need guidance about how to talk with our grandchildren about what's happening in Israel. We hope you find some measure of support in today's discussion. I would like to thank our partners at PJ Library for sharing information about the session with you. I'd also like to thank Zoe Fleischer of Tiny Windows Consulting and Sarah Reed, our JGN colleague, who are helping us facilitate, and of course to welcome our Executive Director and my dear colleague, David Raphael. We invite you, if you have a question, because we want to make this interactive and we want to hear from you, please write it in the chat box or raise your Zoom hand. And we will have questions. Dr. Maital has saved a big chunk of time at the end for questions, and we will ask questions throughout as for clarification. Now it is my great honor to introduce Dr. Sharona Maital, who is in Israel right now, 7 hours ahead. Dr. Sharona Maital is a senior licensed school psychologist in Israel, currently retired, but Dr. Maital continues to volunteer and provide crisis intervention. She has extensive experience from the time of the Yom Kippur War and onward in helping children and families at times of acute crisis. In addition to her professional roles, Dr. Maital is the proud grandparent of 18, that's 18 grandchildren ranging in age from 28 years to 3 months, and therefore has vast personal experience relating across the generations. Over to you, Dr. Maital, with huge gratitude.
Welcome. I'm very happy to be able to talk with you tonight, or tonight my time, this afternoon your time. Sharona is fine. I don't have to be addressed as Dr. Maital. I'd like this to be reasonably informal. When I think about the topic about facing crisis in Israel, I always say to myself, okay, now where do we start? I would say it's been a central part of what I've done professionally over the years. As Terry said, I began my profession. I entered the profession of psychology. I hadn't even totally finished my degree. I still had to finish writing my thesis. And one of our professors collected us, and the women. It was immediately after Yom Kippur. And she collected us and the women, and she said, ladies, we have work to do, and gave us about a 2-day or 3-day crash course in how to talk with the families of the various soldiers in the Yom Kippur War. It was really soldiers who had been killed. It was a sudden war. We didn't expect it at all, but it was soldiers, and how to talk with their families about, and their children about the loss of family members in the various battles. And that was where I started. And since then, unfortunately, there have been quite a few other different wars, different events, events that have given us a lot of consternation, I guess. So let me start by saying, what is it that, what are we calling crisis? How are we defining it? And I think the key issue in crisis is that it's an external event, it's sudden, and it threatens our sense of ability to cope, threatens our sense of stability. And what's happens in crisis, and one of the reasons that the current situation is so difficult, we're living in a completely different time in terms of media, is that people can be threatened by what they physically go through. I'm working with some children who escaped one of the kibbutzim in the south and experienced the threat like I don't think I could ever imagine. Being led out of the kibbutz by soldiers with the terrorists all around them. And thankfully, at least the children I'm working with, thankfully they made it. But those are the real physical threats, or at a lesser level, if God forbid someone is in an accident, they feel that. But in today's day and age of the media, what we also have are indirect traumatization. We have a situation where people, our children, our grandchildren, see things on television. They hear things, they overhear things that the adults are talking about. And those things also create a threat. And it's what we call a secondary traumatization, or a secondary crisis situation, through indirect exposure to these things. And those times we experience anxiety. There's a sense that there may be physical danger. There are all kinds of difficulties in coping and feelings of helplessness. Those are just some of the things that it arouses. And I would say that many of us professionals in Israel today view what's happened here, and it's happened before in the Yom Kippur War and other during the Lebanon War to some extent, is a sense of communal crisis, of national crisis. Next slide, please. And one of the key things that happens in a crisis is that we have disruptions of the continuity in the way we think, in the way we can behave socially, in the historical context that we live in. All kinds of things become disrupted. All of our basic assumptions that we're going to be able to go on with our life from one day to the next without having to make any kind of changes. And all of a sudden, we can't gather in large groups. All of a sudden, we have to be prepared to get to a safe room. Within in my area, we're lucky. We have 1.5 minutes to go to our safe room if there is an alarm. And in fact, I mentioned to the staff that if God forbid there is such a thing, I will have to take my laptop and go down and transfer to there. So there might be some disruption. God willing, there won't be, and we'll be able to continue on without any problems. So far, Zichron Yaakov, where I live, is a small town and in the middle of the country, and nobody's really interested in us, thank God. But all these things get disrupted, and when they get disrupted, all of a sudden we don't know what to do. How do we behave? Where do we go? And next slide, please. And perhaps you're familiar with this, but one of the things that happens in a case like this is there's stress responses which are common to all of us. They're automatic responses. They're not responses that we control, of flight, fight. In this slide, it's freeze, fight, and flight, and fight. But each person responds in a way that is partly a result of their personality, partly a result of our interpretation of what's going on. The dogs in my house just barked. If I interpret that as, wow, somebody is trying to break into my house, I will react with tremendous stress, and then I will either freeze, which happens to some people, or I'll try to run away, or I will try to say, okay, what do I take in my hand to be sure that I can fight this thing? And these are, what's important to remember is these are normal responses, they're normal behaviors in an abnormal situation. The other thing that can happen, and many times what we do, whether we fight or run away, are actually effective coping mechanisms. And one of the important things we've had to do with the people who survived the horrific massacre, and not this, the Shabbat before this last, was to help them understand that by running away, by hiding behind rocks, by bolting the door of the secure room and standing guard with a knife, as the children explained that I've been seeing in this last week, explained that their mother did, to make sure that they had something to fight with. They're actually fairly, they show that there's a degree of coping within that fighting response. It sometimes sounds horrific, but it's an important thing to recognize that people have those strengths. And we can talk about different ways of coping. It can be coping by changing what we believe. The beliefs have been disrupted, we can change them, or think of how we can maintain the beliefs that will help us function. We can talk about social support, particularly when we're with children, the adults and children, and we'll talk about this some more as we move on. Knowing that you have a parent or a grandparent that is with you, and some of the kids who were saved were there with their grandparents, not with their parents. Knowing that the parent is there with you and that the parent is listening to you, looking after you, is critically important. That you're with friends. Another aspect is being able to think it through. And that's one of the things that's most damaged during the initial shock of a crisis, is all of a sudden thinking gets suspended. I'll talk about that a bit more later. And the other thing people do is they do physical things. We know that physical needs are very important, providing people with warmth, food, drink, all of those kinds of things, and also enabling them to do something. One of the things in the Lebanon war that we found was very, very important is each child. I worked with kibbutzim and with other families in small towns, and we recommended that each family help the child make a basket with favorite toys that they could have and keep with them when they went to the safe room. So then they had things they could do, being active, not just sitting and waiting, doing nothing. Next slide, please. So we have all these different things that happen to us. And so how are they the same and how are they different from children? Children, we all experience this tendency either to fight, flee, or freeze. That's common to all of us. But Daniel Siegel, who was a child psychiatrist, presented a wonderful model that helps us understand, and sometimes we use it even with the kids to help them understand. what happens to us when we're faced with the severe stress. And if I'm putting my hand up, I hope you can see it. Yes, and it's on the slide. But and you can try it yourselves as well. But pretend that this is the base of the brain, and this is all the automatic responses. And this is this amygdala and the sympathetic system, which controls the emotions. And when we're in severe stress and there's a crisis and we're in severe stress, these are the systems that are primarily functioning. They're telling us, and it's a survival mechanism, get the heck out of there, or you better be absolutely freeze, pretend you're dead. And there were some who did that and survived that way. Or there was a young woman who survived in a basically in a garbage dumpster, pretending she was dead. And she told her story afterwards. And the other thing that we do as adults is we start to think things through, okay? And if this is our prefrontal cortex, which is usually covering the whole middle part of our brain and giving us executive functions, giving us the ability to control what we do and to control those emotions. They're funneled through, and we're saying, okay, well, this is what's happening and that's what's happening. So this, I can do this and I can do that. Well, in a crisis, in extreme stress, the lid is flipped. And one of the important things is to help put the lid back on things with information, with thinking. Now, with children, one of the differences between adults and children is that children, these abilities are not as highly developed as they are among adults. They don't have all the experience that we have. And even among adults, by the way, when we don't have experience or when those emotions activate things that were traumatic in the past, sometimes it's very hard to bring the prefrontal cortex, the thinking abilities, the cognitive abilities back down to protect us, to help us cope. And it helps sometimes to show kids this. He shows kids this model too, to help them understand how their brain is actually influencing their behavior in extreme stress and in difficult times. So one of the things we need to do, next slide, and I'm getting to the heart of the things. One of the things that's perhaps the most important, the step one, I say here, is self-awareness. We need to think about, okay, how are we responding to what's happening in Israel? Even before we think about talking with our grandkids, what are we feeling? What are we doing when this happens? Are we sitting in front of the television or listening to the radio nonstop, almost in a freeze, in a catatonic freeze? Where are we staying at home and can't do anything because we have to know what's happening? Or are we frenetically going about trying to do things? I know that's my tendency, is to immediately run about and say, okay, what can I do? How can I do things? And to keep myself quite busy as a way of coping. Are we able to take a deep, deep breath and relax and let ourselves go? Are we able to accept the fact that, yes, this is very, very difficult? And all of us, many of us, the initial response this last week was to sort of be in total disbelief. And what's important is we allow ourselves to be there and to accept these things as normal they seem like abnormal behaviors, but they're normal behaviors to a very, very abnormal situation. This is not the way things always are. And it's one of the things we need to realize and be able to say to ourselves is this is not how things will always be. And we need to be able to transmit that to our kids, to our grandkids. Next slide, please. So children they have very sensitive antenna. We say, oh, I've calmed down. I can talk to the kids. They're going to be fun, But as we can see in this illustration, this wonderful illustration by a young psychologist in Israel, who, all this stuff is behind the mom and she's trying to present herself as calm, possibly cool, but look at the expression on the child's face. She knows exactly how mom feels. And they see what we feel, they feel what we feel, and they respond in return, in turn. They also, if we are avoidant and don't want to talk about things, we don't have to tell them don't talk about that. They sense it. They know it. Their antennae are very, very, very keen. And that's one of the things that we need to realize when we're talking to children, to grandchildren, is that a key factor is how we're feeling and how we are coping. And if we can cope, if we are feeling that we have resilience, that we have resources that we can draw upon, then we can transmit that to the kids. And that's a key thing. I can tell you that I certainly was able to make use of these things. One of the stories I think I told the people, told Kay and David when we were talking about setting this up, was how during the Yom Kippur War, one of the things that really, really helped me, I was a young mom with 2 little kids. We were told to black out all of our windows and stay in our safe rooms. And in those days it was a shelter. And my grandparents, God bless them, who were still alive, called me right after my husband had been drafted and said, "Don't worry, we're coming." And it was just before the Sukkot holiday. And they came with, not only did they come, they came with the sukkah and stayed with me for the first week. Knowing that people are there for you, that you're not alone is a key thing. It's critical. And now in turn, during the last week, I must say I spent much of my time with my 3 younger grandchildren. The middle one you saw in the picture at the beginning, helping keep them busy because their mom was just really stressed. And it was easier for me to be there and play with them than it was for her. And there's no school in session. We're finding a lot of young parents needing the support of their parents, of the grandparents, to help play with the kids, to keep them busy, knowing that you're not alone. Okay, next slide. So what are some of the things?
Sharona, excuse me interrupting you. Just before we jump to the next slide, I wondered if, since you so eloquently spoke about how we are feeling, I wonder if you would be open to asking our guests, our participants, if they could put in chat. Well, I'm just going to ask. I think we would all love to know how we're each feeling. Would you be open to that our guests all put in chat how they are feeling right now? Thank you so much.
That's very, very important for us to be able to share how we're feeling and what are our thoughts. And I'll explain the whole thing about thoughts and feelings, because one of the things that we know now in recent years about helping people with trauma is that we want to focus on the prefrontal, on the cortex, on the parts that help us think and work things through cognitively, logically, even more than the feelings, because that helps us exercise control. It doesn't negate the feelings. The feelings are definitely important and there, but we need to be able to deal with them. We need to be able to cope with them, despite them. I see that people are sad, frightened for Israel, angry. Yes, these are very fearful that it's going to escalate, and fearful about anti-Semitism, I see, and how to support friends. It's interesting because they actually speak to the points that I'm about to present to you. One of the things we need to do is simply accept our responses as normal and know that each person has their own style of responding. Some are going to look to be with other people. Some are going to want to be by themselves. Being by yourself all the time is not a great thing at a time like this, but for some people, that's what they need. They need the quiet. Others are going to need to get out and do physical activity. And it's none of these are either or, by the way. Different times of day and different are one minute I can need to be by myself and have some quiet. Another after that, I can need to be with people. And then if I'm with people too much, I need to do something else. These are all very normal. And what we need to be able to say to people, to say to our children, to say to ourselves is, it's okay. We have to be self-compassionate with these things. And then we need to acknowledge these things. Yeah, we need to accept it. We need to acknowledge it, that it's okay. And then we need to give people hope. Tikva. I think it's not by chance that our anthem is Hatikva. We have to have hope. Because if we don't maintain that sense of hope, then we go from what's called acute stress responses and move, unfortunately, and into a post-traumatic stress situation. What's interesting is that, and I think it's important, not quite yet. What's interesting is that people tend to think that everybody in Israel is post-traumatic and that it's pervasive. What we do know now is that if we can help people at the initial stages of a trauma, and we're in an ongoing situation now. Most traumas they happen, it's over, and we say, okay, that happened, it's in the past. Now we're going to move ahead and do things. And we're in a situation where we're both in the trauma and already trying to look at how we can move ahead, how things can be rebuilt, what can be done. But we need a lot of patience because the chaos and the rupture of our basic tenets has not been repaired. That's part of providing hope, is looking at how we can repair these things. But we have to find these experiences that can help us feel that we belong, that give us hope. Even coming together tonight, or tonight for me, today for you, is something I think that's really, really important. And we need to help kids look ahead and emphasize doing and positive thoughts. Apropos that, taking action, doing things is really, really important. It helps us move into the mode of using our executive skills, our prefrontal cortex. If I think about the kids that I've been seeing this last week who escaped the terrible massacre on their kibbutz, and I asked the 10-year-old, I think it's 10 or 11, I asked him, what should I tell grandparents in the U.S. about helping, about how you cope, what happens? And he said, tell them that, okay, that that Am Yisrael Chai, that we're gonna change things, and we're gonna get at these terrible terrorists, and things will be okay. And I thought that, this is amazing. This is a kid who's been through the worst things possible, and yet he was looking to the future. He was saying, we'll move on. So I think that's a really, really important part of it. One of the things that gives people hope is doing things, being able to do things. We need to be able to do. And that's one part of it. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. And I want to bring you something which some of you may have seen. It's been running around Facebook, at least around here. And it's a story based on Pooh, Winnie the Pooh. It's based on Winnie the Pooh. I don't believe it's actually written in the story of Winnie the Pooh. But I put the essentials of it. I'll read the whole thing if I can. I think we have time. It's Piglet's response to Pooh when he's scared, and I think it exemplifies how we can deal with such things when we're together with our grandchildren. I'm just so scared, blurted out Pooh. Yes, said Piglet. For a moment there was silence. When Pooh didn't appear to be saying anything further, I'm just so scared, blurted out Pooh. So anxious because I don't feel like things are getting any better. Seem familiar? If anything, I feel like they might be getting worse. People are angry because they're so scared, and they're turning on one another, and there seems to be no clear plan out there. And I worry about my friends and the people I love, and I wish so much that I could give them all a hug. And oh, Piglet, I'm so scared, and I cannot tell you how much I wish it wasn't so. Piglet was thoughtful as he looked out at the blue of the skies, peeping between the branches of the trees and the 100-acre wood, and listened to his friend. I'm here, he simply said. I hear you, Pooh, and I'm here. For a moment to tell me not to be so silly, that I should stop getting myself into a state and pull myself together, that it's hard for everyone right now? No, said Piglet, quite decisively. No, I am very much not going to do any of those things. But, said Pooh, I can't change the world right now, continued Piglet. And I am not going to patronize you with platitudes about how everything will be okay, because I don't know that. What I can do, though, Pooh, is that I can make sure that you know that I'm here, and that I will always be here to listen and to support you, and for you to know that you are heard. I can't make those anxious feelings go away, not really. But I can promise you that all the time I have breath left in my body, you won't ever need to feel those anxious feelings alone. And it was a strange thing, because even as Piglet said that, Pooh could feel some of those anxious feelings start to loosen their grip on him, and could feel one or two of them start to slither away into the forest, cowed by his friend, who sat there stolidly next to him, who thought he had never been more grateful to have Piglet in his life. So this is the message from
Sharona,
yeah,
a
yes,
couple of questions about the story
yeah.
is we have a question: what is the title of the Winnie of this book? It's a great read to children of all ages. And then I wonder if you could see if our guests have any questions about the message of the story.
Okay. First of all, when I checked it, this is not a direct quote from a Winnie the Pooh book. Winnie the Pooh is a series of books called Winnie the Pooh. And we did a check. It's a Winnie the Pooh type from the books, but and the characters are, but this is something that's been running around on the internet, and I really do not know the source.
Maybe Sharona could share the link with Terry and we can put it in the follow-up.
Anonymous.
Yeah, and this abbreviated version that's on the screen will go out in our slides that we send out.
Yeah,
okay,
and I can send you the full version. It's been running around on Facebook, and I have not found the exact source.
Got it.
But
Sharona, we have a couple of questions, though.
Sure.
No, why don't you go ahead? I think you have one or two more slides, and then we'll go directly into questions. Thank you.
Okay, or if there are questions about Winnie the Pooh and the things I've said until now, I can take them.
There are a series, including Now We Are Six. Look up Christopher Robin too.
Yeah.
So just some guidance from our guests.
Robin, when the House of Winnie at Winnie the Pooh Corner. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Sharon.
Stay Milne. Thank you. Questions? Do you want to present them to me, or?
Well, the questions are about the topic in general, so feel free to
Okay,
go back to your last slide.
let me go back to the last slide or two, and then we'll take time. Okay. One of the things, so the key point in Winnie Pooh is listening. And one of the things we need to do is we often start by telling kids things. We need to try to understand what they know and how they understand the situation. We need to see what they're feeling, what they're thinking. And one of the difficulties, and I'll address it with one of the questions that was sent in advance, is that, especially with the older ones, they have a lot of ideas of their own. And we need to ask them to tell us what they personally think, to differentiate between their own views and their generalizations, what they hear from other people, try to get them to think about those things. And we sometimes need to suspend judgment. We need to let them have ideas that are different from ours. And the little ones, and I'll talk more about this later in a minute, is we need to listen to the little ones by observing and joining their play. With the children I've been working with in the last week, and forgive me, but they're the most predominant in my thoughts right now. The little 5-year-old, when I asked the children to tell me about what happened to them, they said they don't want to talk about it. So I said, well, would you like to draw? And they did. And in the process of drawing, they basically drew the entire scene of what happened. And then they started talking and telling me about it. And the little 4.5-year-old, almost 5, she wasn't really drawing, but every once in a while she would come over and make marks on her brothers and her cousins, because there were actually 2 cousins and her brother were there all together, and they drew together. She would make marks that looked like they were like either rockets coming down, or could have been crying. But then she took the doll things and she was going around with a little doll's teacup and a teacup, a little tea server. And she was going around giving everybody something to drink. She was looking after the basic needs. And so she was telling us a part of the story that she had understood in the way that she understood it. And it was important to relate to the fact that it was important that they had their food, that they had water, that they were looked after, and that she was doing that. So that was her thing. So we can hear and see what children are feeling and what they're telling us very often in the way in which they're playing, in the way in which they draw. And we need to accept it for what it is, not say, no, it didn't happen that way, it happened that way, or anything like that, but to suspend our judgment because it's their experience of what happened. And we know that we process things according to what our experience was, not according to what actually happened. And then when we talk with them, we need to talk with them, not at them. And we need to be able to share ideas that are different with honesty, and without trying to debate and win them over, especially when they're older. And I can tell you an experience that was, in some sense, actually, we had a crisis on a crisis because we've had all of the divisions among people here in Israel and the debates about judicial reform and the tremendous demonstrations and everything that happened even before this horrible massacre and war. And I can share an experience with one of my grandchildren who comes from a very Orthodox background, family. My daughter has become very Orthodox. I have children at all ends of the spectrum. And from their perspective, they had one perspective about the way things should be going in the country. And when I asked him, what they're saying in school about these different things, he said, can't talk to you about that. And I explained to him the concept of dialogue versus debate, that I really wanted to learn from him what he was thinking and how he saw things. And whatever he was thinking and the way he saw it, that was, that's his thoughts. And I also wanted him to be able to hear what I was thinking. And I wasn't going to tell him that one thing was right and the other thing wrong, but rather that we could have these different ways of thinking. And I explained to him the rules of dialogue, that we really suspend judgment and that we listen to what the other person is saying without denigrating or denying it. And so he started to talk and he told me, and then he was willing to listen to what I said. And at the end of the conversation, he said, Savta, my kids call me Savta, thank you. I'm glad we talked. Because I didn't argue with him. I didn't tell him he was wrong. I listened. And I think it was important for me that he felt that he could tell me what he was thinking. It was very, very touching. So. Yeah.
With your permission, this is unscripted. You have one more piece of guidance you'd like to share with us, which is the importance of activities with our grandchildren. We have a number of questions. Would you be comfortable with our not addressing that now and sending it out with the other slides?
I'd like to take just 1 minute though, because I'd like to show you some things. Okay.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
Because one of the things that we're talking with, both for calming ourselves and working with little kids, there are all kinds of things that we can use that help us. One of the things that we need to do is just learn to breathe, to take the time to breathe and take a breath in and then a long breath out. And if we keep doing that, it's a very calming experience. Well, with kids, it's not always easy to do. So we have a couple things that are make it very easy. And actually, it's good for us too, because as the grandparents, we can help them. Blowing a balloon. Okay. If you try to blow a balloon, you take a breath in and then you keep doing long breaths out. Balloons. Bubbles. Children love soap bubbles. It gets them to breathe in and blow out. And the other thing which relates to what I was talking about is play, using different figures to use to help us to say things and do things. And then it's not Savta who's saying it, but it's the show or the play that we're putting on about what's happening. So we have all of those things we can use. And sometimes, yes, we do need to distract them. Hugging and staying close, which we've talked about. And talking about, yes, it's very important that when we talk to kids, and we actually put this out in a press release to the reporters as well, both in English and in Hebrew, to AP and CNN and all those people, is ask about coping. Not, don't focus on the terrible things people have seen and are feeling, but what can we do? How can we cope? To talk about future, about coping, it's critical. It creates a sense of resilience. It creates a sense that, yes, we're going to get beyond this. So let me end here and we'll go to your questions and take the rest of our time for that.
Thank you, Sharona. Janie asks, we always tell our little grandkids that the boogie, don't know how Americans say it, isn't real and nothing is hiding under their beds. How do we avoid lying?
How do you avoid lying?
I think maybe another way to say it is, how do you give age appropriate information? Maybe like, how do you tell the truth, but in an age appropriate way?
Right. Okay. It's sometimes we do need to reassure children that there's nothing under their bed, nothing really under their bed, simply because they are in a safe environment. And yes, among the children who've experienced trauma, we can't always say that. And honesty is really the best way to deal with it. We have to admit that most of the time we're fine. And there are things that can help us be fine, knowing that our parents are around, knowing that we can tell people if we need them, knowing that there are soldiers who are guarding us and looking after us. Those are important things. And yet, not denying the fact that, yes, it's scary because we don't always know for sure. And, it's funny, but kids watch all these cartoons and movies with all kinds of bad guys in them. And yet we think that they don't really know that there's evil, that they know that it's all make believe and pretend. But the truth is that all the movies and all the things that kids see are much more real to them than we think. They know these things are out there. They know people die. They know people, it sounds horrible, but they know that. And if we can't, we need to be able to address it directly. We do need to be able to talk to even young children and say to them, yeah, that person is not going to come back. And it's very sad. And it's appropriate to be sad with them. and to help them do things that can help remember the person, help them remember the person, help remember the good things about the person, help them find ways that this sense that life goes on. The person is gone, but life goes on. We've had a crisis. There's been many of our beliefs in our safety in the country, certainly in the southern communities, have been shattered. And yet, with everything happening here, there's a tremendous sense that life goes on. And sometimes when you're far away, things seem more scary than when you're actually here, because you have the sense, you hear about what's happening in one place, you generalize it to the entire country. Someone said to me the other day, they said, "Are things open?" I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, can people shop? Can they do things?" And I said, "Except for very few places, most places, yes." But the impression was, from listening to the foreign media, that everything was completely shut down. Yeah.
Dr. Jaffe asked about, like, specifically talking with teenagers, if you have any advice for what those conversations might look like.
I would say with most teenagers, the conversations can be very adult. They are far more cognizant, and they're thinking. We have to help them use these executive functions that they have, their ability to analyze situations, to think logically. Sometimes they will think out of the box in ways that are, in a sense, quite logical. They may not be what we think and our logic, but you know what? Maybe we need to listen to them, because maybe they have some creative ideas, and we need to not put them down all the time. And we also, at the same time, we also have to acknowledge the difficulties they're dealing with. They're dealing with a whole lot of different things that are going on, whether it's social pressures, and fear of standing out. And those are things that we have to acknowledge and help them feel like they're independent, like they're making their own decisions and thinking for themselves. And at the same time, planting different ideas and letting them examine them, using their own skills.
Thank you.
Sharona, thank you so much. We have just a few minutes left, and we did get a couple of questions in advance, two of which were to do with the kidnap victims and how to talk to our kids. So one of our participants wrote in advance that their friend, an old family friend who lived on Kibbutz Be'eri, is missing since October 7th. And it was an incredible question. The person who wrote in said that while they were out for lunch with her grandchildren on Saturday, the local news channel flashed Vivian's picture on the screen, and her 6-year-old grandson exclaimed, "Look, there's Vivian." And fortunately, the French fries arrived at the perfect time. So the question from this grandparent is, what is an appropriate explanation for a 5 to 10-year-old about Vivian's disappearance? And we had a separate question to do with the hostages, about how to explain the scary images on posters with the word kidnapped on the top.
Okay. I think that if I may comment on cultural differences, having been back in the US for various periods of sabbaticals, and one of my daughter-in-laws is an American who came on Aliyah, and I see the differences there. There's a tremendous, I mean, here too, it's not that it doesn't exist elsewhere, but there's a tremendous, I think, desire to to spare our children and to have them believe that everything's always going to be good, comfortable, pleasant, and to not let them experience sad things, not let them experience that bad things happen in the world and in life, to be protective of them. It's interesting because it contrasts, I think, with what happens here and with what happens in, and to some extent, something that I just got, that someone sent me today from Germany, of her grandkids, of her daughter-in-law and grandchild. And that goes back to what I said about being honest and being open. And not being afraid that children can't cope with the bad news. And I think that, yes, the 5-year-old may not totally understand, the 6-year-old, certainly the 7 and 8-year-old can understand that, yes, there were people that these very bad people kidnapped, that they took, and that we're very concerned about them, and that we want to do things so that we make sure that they get released. In Israel, I don't ever remember there being an issue about letting children know when Gilad Shalit or others soldiers were kidnapped. It was talked about. It was not something that children. Now, how much does the 5-year-old know or understand? I'm not sure. But they do know that there was somebody who was taken and that we're sad, that we're missing him. We hope that he's going to come back. Those kinds of things they know. And if you can show the last slide that I gave you, did I put it up or do I have it?
So
Yeah, 1 second. I can do that in just a minute.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Just to take a second, because I know we're toward the end of our time. This is a real picture of something happening in Germany, in one of the German towns. And it's a mother and her child and her teen, I guess a young teen, putting up the posters, the kidnap posters. In other words, they are doing things to say, we need to do something to help make sure that these people are freed. And so this relates to the idea of trying to help, of doing things, which is so important. It's okay, you don't have to leave that there. Trying to help to do something. Yes, the person is missing. We need to see what we can do. We can support these people. We can help these people. We can make it known in the world that things have to be done. So hopefully that answers your question. And I think, kids can handle these. If we can handle it, and that's part of it, is that we need to be able to take a deep breath and say, it's okay. My kid will be okay if they know that these things are happening, as long as I'm there to support them and I'm with them, and that I can pay attention to how they're behaving and reacting. I saw that there were a number of things. I noticed, out of the corner of my eye, that there were a number of things about anti-Semitism and some of those issues. I didn't get the exact questions, but if you want me to address any of that.
So let's just talk about logistics. We have one more question that a grandparent sent in to do with their Orthodox grandchildren. We are at just about 1 o'clock here, which is 8 o'clock your time, Sharona. And I asked you in advance, and you kindly agreed to stay on for a few minutes. So thank you for doing that. To our friends who need to leave now, we thank you so much for joining us. We did commit that the session would be from 12 to 1. If you have to leave because you have other commitments, we so appreciate your being here. If you'd like to stay on for 5 minutes, we'd love that too. And in fact, if you will allow me, Sharon, I'll pose this last question very briefly. Perhaps you could
Yeah.
answer briefly, and then people can unmute themselves and just talk.
Okay, for
So
sure.
our this grandparent wrote in, how do you recommend discussing recent or other tragic events with my Orthodox grandchildren who come from a viewpoint that everything is God's will? I have to be very careful talking with my grandchildren about things that I see differently as a non-literalist, non-Orthodox Jew.
I think this relates to the point that I made about dialogue versus debate. I'm not, if I would, if I think that and this is the way I experience it with my own Orthodox children, if I believe that I should win them over to my opinion, then it's going to be very difficult. I really can't talk to them. But if I'm willing to hear them out, and sometimes we can, it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both and. We can both believe that things are God's will and also believe that there are a lot of things that we need to do and a lot of things that maybe we didn't do right that we need to change. And it's not either or, it can be both and. And my experience is that even Orthodox people who believe strongly in God and God's will are willing to think about also about what the things are that we need to do. And I'm not going to try. I wouldn't try to convince them that it's not God's will. I mean, what do I know? You know, I'm in Hebrew we would say kotonti. I'm like that. I don't know what God's will is. Okay.
Right.
And if they want to believe that that's God's will and that helps them cope, then why not? In fact, by the way, I will make the point that for many people, the belief in God and belief that God is the overarching mover of things is a very, very helpful means of coping. When I've worked in the children's department at Hadassah Hospital as a spiritual counselor, it's another one of the things another one of the hats I've worn. The religious families very often were better able to cope with severe illnesses and things of that sort because they were able to look for the good despite everything that they were dealing with.
There's a great question in the chat. H, would you want to come on video and ask that aloud, or would you prefer that we read from the chat?
Read from the chat. Why don't you read from the chat for now?
Okay. Asks that they have grandchildren in day school that are non-Orthodox with a large number of students with family, friends, personal connections with Israel. So any difference in approach when the situation is personal versus maybe a bit removed?
Yes. In fact, during the Gulf War, I was on sabbatical in Washington and my children were in the day school there. And there were many, many children who had family in Israel. Many of the embassy children were in the school. And it was very important for us to give children opportunities, as we do here in Israel, to express their feelings, to express their understanding and give them information. Giving children information is actually a very important thing because then they can cognitively process what's happening rather than, we think that, oh, we're not going to tell them. One of the things that happens with children when we don't tell them is they make it up. They have to have a story or a narrative about what's happening. And if we don't tell them in a clear way, in a logical way of what's happening, they're going to have a story anyway. So we really need to tell them what's really happening. And we found that that was very important among the kids who had direct contact, was to give them, of course, in an age-appropriate way, don't have to tell them all the gore and the details, but to give them enough information so that they can process it, and also give them the tools to say, okay, let's do something. I have grandchildren in a day school. I don't know if it's the same day school or not, where there are many children who know people in Israel and are very, very close to Israel, many of the teachers who've been directly affected. And they've done assemblies with singing songs for Israel. Those are planes overhead. We hear them all the time from this hour on. You know, you're getting a sense of what we're dealing with here in Israel. You know, letting them, when they know what's happening, also giving things to do, whether it's writing letter, you know, even little ones. My 5-year-old grandson, when I was playing with him and stuff, when we were talking about soldiers, and I collected some things that people were looking for to give to the soldiers, and I said, you know what, let's write the soldiers a letter. And he wrote them a letter saying, you know, he drew a picture and he dictated some stuff saying, thank you for guarding us and looking after us. And these are the kinds of things kids can do. On one of the kibbutzim during the Lebanon, well, I think it was during the Lebanon War, it was else one of the other clashes. There were a lot of soldiers not too far from the kibbutz that I was working with as the psychologist for the educational system there. And the kids, together with their preschool teachers, all baked cookies and cakes to bring to the soldiers, you know, to have sent to the soldiers, and they made pictures for them and things of that sort. So giving these kids things to do is really important, and providing them with the information and helping them process it.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. Let's make this our last question. Ellen has kindly agreed to appear on camera. Hello, Ellen.
Hi, Ellen. Hi.
You could just unmute, please, if you would, Ellen.
Unmute, right. Hello, hi.
Hi.
So, you know, what I have seen over time in my work, and to some degree in my own experience as a grandparent, is differences in belief systems in, you know, various areas, but particularly maybe right here. And you just referred to, you know, Orthodox kids who are Orthodox, and so there's ideological differences, generational, and we talk to our grandchildren in, you know, well, personally speaking, my grandchildren like to listen to my point of view, and sometimes I know that I have to be just a little bit careful about where I go, because they talk with their parents too, you know, very verbal family, such. And I've, you know, kind of fallen in the mud a couple times and realized that I need to dialogue a little bit with my son and see where he's coming from. So right here we have, I think, a really touchy one right now. You know, this all of the, you know, it's here in the United States, it's a little bit, I shall say, people are saying things like it's hard to be visibly Jewish. I'm not saying that for myself necessarily, but this is so. Yeah.
There's a real sense, I think, that of threat. That's part of the crisis. A threat to our sense of who we are. A threat to our identity. And what do we do? And yes, when we're talking intergenerationally, it may have to be a family-wide dialogue, or a dialogue between us and our children and our grandchildren. And the principles of dialogue, as opposed to debate, I think are really important. If we can agree with our children and with our grandchildren that multiple perspectives are legitimate, but it's also legitimate to listen and be attuned to what other people are thinking, even if it's not what I'm thinking. And then in talking with my grandkids or talking with my kids, I'm not trying to tell them, think like me, but I am trying to encourage them to hear different perspectives. Now, sometimes it's possible, and sometimes I've some of my Orthodox grandkids will say to me, Sakta, don't go there. Don't talk to me about that. And sometimes I do back off. Yeah. And sometimes you have to find just the right opportunity, the right time. And other times a grandkid will open up to me and say, but don't tell my parents we talked about that. And that's also okay. We're allowed to have our times by ourselves. So it's really partly a matter of finding the right path and the right opportunities. Sometimes you can do it when you're out when you go out together or when you're doing things together. And sometimes we just have to, accept the fact that our views and our kids' views are different. And see how we can expose them, but not necessarily try to change what's happening, because we may not be able to. We may just make it worse.
Sharona, thank you from the
You're
bottom
very
of our hearts
welcome.
for your generosity in agreeing to. You jumped on this with just a few days notice, and so kind of you to prepare and to, I don't know, give us share your space with us here in the States and to guide us in this way. We so appreciate it. To all our friends who've joined us, we will send everybody who registered the recording, the chat transcript. Daya, thanks for that idea. And we will include the slides and follow up with a brief survey because we really appreciate and need your feedback about the sessions we provide you and whether they are helpful. Zoe, Sarah, thank you so much for your tech support. And Sharona, 1,000 thanks from us in the United States. And we send you
You're very welcome.
all our love and prayers for peace.